Her brother was talking outside, but she pulled me into her arms and said, "Don't let go." The words caught me off guard, sharp as the smell of motor oil in the small garage where I was supposed to be fixing the coffee machine, not untangling the sudden jolt of my chest. I hadn't even noticed her standing there until she was there, warm, firm, and entirely in control. I'd been stocking shelves behind the counter of the little independent bookstore where I worked, a place more familiar with quiet than chaos. Sunlight spilled across stacks of old novels, painting the room in a lazy, golden glow. She had walked in without warning, wearing a jacket that smelled faintly of lavender and smoke, hair pulled back loosely, a few strands curling around her face like she didn't care if they did. Confident, yes, but not unreachable. There was a softness, too, tucked into the corners of her smile, like she carried a world most people didn't see. We had met before, in passing, a casual conversation about the latest arrivals, an offhand joke about a broken espresso machine, but nothing that mattered, not until today. Today, her presence filled the room differently. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me fumble with the dripping coffee maker, and I felt the weight of her gaze before I felt my own awareness of her closeness. "You'll get it eventually," she said quietly, just above the hum of the overhead lights. No condescension, just observation. It was infuriating and comforting at the same time. I laughed, though nervously, unsure why my hands were trembling as I wiped them on my jeans. She didn't laugh, not yet, just tilted her head and watched, as if measuring something invisible. Then, without any warning, a voice called from outside. Her brother, I assumed, talking in that casual, teasing tone I'd imagine family has when they think no one's listening. She stiffened, like a signal went off somewhere deep in her chest, and then, faster than I could process, she reached over and pulled me close. Arms around me, her chest pressing against mine. The warmth was sudden, and I froze, because nothing in my life had prepared me for the weight of her presence. Not just her body, but the intensity of her being pressed into this quiet, mundane room. "Don't let go," she whispered, soft, almost vulnerable, but with a certainty that made my throat tight. I could hear the faint tremor in her voice, subtle enough that it could have been imagined, but her hands gripping my arms said otherwise. My mind went blank. My body obeyed, standing still, rooted to the spot as her gaze met mine for a fraction too long. There was no room for conversation. None of the usual clumsy jokes or awkward explanations. Only that electric, suspended moment where the outside world, the talking brother, the ticking clock, the scent of old paper, disappeared, leaving just the two of us. I don't know how long we stayed like that, and I didn't care. The memory of her arms, the pull, the words, "Don't let go," lingered in a way that made every nerve in my body hum. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel it. That small, impossible spark of something unspoken, something neither of us had named, yet both of us understood perfectly. And somehow, I knew I couldn't stop thinking about it. I hadn't expected to see her again that afternoon, but the bookstore's small repair nook, where we sometimes tinkered with old registers or leaky coffee machines, was where she found me. She was crouched over a pile of unsorted books, sleeves rolled up just past her elbows, hair falling forward so it brushed her cheek. She didn't look up when I approached, just murmured something about needing help with a jammed drawer. I knelt beside her, hands hovering over the mechanism. Her scent, warm, faintly floral, slightly smoky, hit me before she even looked my way. I wanted to say something, anything, but she didn't give me an opening. Instead, she worked in silence, fingers nimble, precise. I noticed the tension in her shoulders, the subtle crease between her brows, the way her lips pressed together when she focused. I offered a suggestion. She didn't smile, didn't laugh, just shook her head and adjusted the drawer herself. There was a guardedness to her I hadn't seen before, like she was afraid of letting anyone in, even me. And maybe she was. My chest tightened in a way that was almost painful, watching her keep everything so carefully controlled, while I just watched. "You always do this alone?" I asked softly, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't startle her. She paused, glancing at me out of the corner of her eye. Her gaze flickered, brief, like a candle caught in a draft. Then she went back to the drawer. Usually, she said finally, voice clipped but not unkind. It's easier. Easier. That one word hung in the air, heavier than she probably intended. And in that pause, I noticed the tiny details. The slight tremor in her fingers as she gripped the edge of the drawer, the way she exhaled a little too fast, the faint shadows under her eyes. She was tired, not just physically. Something in her posture said she carried weight she didn't let anyone touch. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't. Instead, I offered a small smile, just a fraction, hoping she'd see it and maybe, somehow, feel a fraction of ease. She didn't look at me, but her shoulders relaxed a millimeter, a tiny, almost invisible concession. When the drawer finally clicked open, she leaned back against the counter and let out a sigh that sounded like it had been waiting for hours to escape. Her laugh, soft, almost surprised, escaped in a breathless little hiccup when she noticed I had been holding the tray of parts awkwardly for her. "You're good at this," she said, and for a moment, the edges of her guard softened. We stood there, quiet now, the room smelling faintly of old paper and machine oil, sunlight catching dust motes between us. I didn't reach for her, didn't say anything, just let the moment linger. And she, for the briefest heartbeat, let herself seem real. Then, almost imperceptibly, she brushed her hand against mine as she straightened, and my chest stuttered. Not quite a touch, not quite an invitation, but enough. Enough to make me aware of her in a way I couldn't stop thinking about. And she looked at me, just for a fraction too long, and smiled. A small, fleeting thing, but it carried the weight of all the unspoken things between us. The rain started almost without warning, drumming against the bookstore windows with that steady, insistent rhythm that makes the world feel smaller. She was still there, crouched over the counter, cataloging new arrivals while I wiped down the shelves nearby. The air smelled of wet asphalt, old books, and her, some combination that made my chest tighten without warning. I leaned against the counter, just close enough to notice the small, subtle things. The way her fingers trembled as she flipped through a stack of paperback covers, the way her hair fell in soft waves that she absent-mindedly tucked behind her ear. There was a vulnerability to her in this quiet light, one she didn't usually allow anyone to see. We hadn't said much in the last hour, just small, practical sentences. But the quiet between us hummed, heavy with unspoken possibilities. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but every time I opened my mouth, the words felt wrong, too clumsy, too obvious. She caught my gaze once, just a flicker, and I felt the heat rush to my face. "Do you ever get tired of this?" I asked finally, nodding toward the endless stacks, the quiet hours that stretched into the evening. She didn't answer immediately, just hesitated, as if weighing what she could safely reveal. Then, finally, a whisper, "Sometimes. But it's worth it. Worth it." The way she said it, soft, careful, made me think she was hiding more than just fatigue. A sudden vibration from her phone on the counter made both of us start. She glanced down, frowned, then frowned harder, and I realized it was him. Her ex, someone she hadn't mentioned but who seemed to have an immediate, tense hold on her. She let the call go to voicemail, but her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightening. I felt a pang of something: jealousy, protectiveness, confusion. All at once, the storm outside pressed in closer, rain tapping against the glass like the rhythm of a heartbeat I could feel in my chest. She shifted closer to the counter, and I moved a fraction too, instinctively, the space between us shrinking. I could smell the faint trace of coffee she'd spilled earlier, see the faint blush creeping across her cheeks from the awkward proximity. She looked at me then, eyes searching mine for a fraction longer than comfort allowed. You understand, don't you?" she asked quietly. I wanted to nod, to tell her everything I was thinking, everything I felt, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not with the storm outside, the world waiting, the rules we both pretended to follow. Instead, I stayed still, letting the air hang heavy between us. My hand hovered near hers as she reached for a book, almost brushing, almost connecting. That fleeting nearness sent a jolt through me, and I had to remind myself to breathe. The moment didn't last. She straightened, pulled back, and looked away, leaving the almost things, the words, the touches, the confessions, unspoken, suspended in the dim light of the storm. But even as she returned to her work, the memory of her nearness clung to me, impossible to shake. And for a long, slow heartbeat, I thought about what it would have been like to let go. We were sitting on the worn leather couch in the back office, the fluorescent light above flickering just enough to make shadows pool in the corners. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, but the quiet it left behind was heavier than the storm itself. I hadn't intended to stay. Really, I hadn't. But she had sat down first, and somehow, I had followed. We didn't speak at first. I watched her hands rest lightly on her knees, fingers tapping a rhythm that seemed almost unconscious. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, and I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing. Her gaze was distant, fixed on a cracked tile in the floor, as if she was searching for answers there. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, almost trembling, though she tried to mask it with a sigh. "Do you ever feel like none of this makes sense?" I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully, because I could feel the tension, the fragility in her tone, and I didn't want to ruin it with the wrong word. She glanced at me then, and her eyes, so steady, so controlled most of the time, flickered with something raw, unguarded. "You and me this," she gestured vaguely between us. "I don't know why it feels like it matters more than it should, but it does." Her words hit me in a way nothing else had. It wasn't about romance, not exactly. It was about gravity, about the way her presence could make the world seem smaller, sharper, and heavier all at once. I wanted to say something, to bridge the invisible gap, but my mouth went dry. We just stared at each other. Long, heavy seconds that stretched and warped time, where the office, the rain, the light, all of it, disappeared. I noticed the subtle curve of her shoulders, the tension that ebbed slightly with each breath, the way her lips pressed together as if she was holding back more than words could carry. I started, then stopped. Words failed me. She tilted her head slightly, waiting, but not pushing, waiting for something to break the surface. Finally, she exhaled sharply, a sound of both frustration and relief. "What are we doing?" she asked. Not accusing, not demanding, just raw and unfiltered. Her eyes were locked on mine, and I could see every little crack she usually kept hidden, the exhaustion, the worry, the faint tremor of hope. I swallowed hard. "I don't know," I admitted honestly, the truth bitter and electric. Her hand moved slightly, brushing against the edge of the couch, close enough that I could see the tension in her fingers, but she didn't reach for mine. She wasn't asking for comfort, only clarity, clarity I couldn't give. The silence returned, heavier than before, filled with all the things we hadn't said and couldn't. Her gaze drifted to the window, rain-streaked glass reflecting her face in fractured light. And then, almost in a whisper, she said something I would carry with me far longer than the rain or the storm or any of the nights after. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this, or if I even want to be." The words hung there, devastating, vulnerable, unshielded, and I realized in that moment that everything between us had changed. Nothing could be the same again. I found her sitting at the small corner table of the cafe we sometimes used after closing hours, the dim light catching the edges of her face. She was quiet, almost fragile, staring down at her coffee like it had all the answers. I hesitated before sitting, unsure if I was intruding or exactly where I was supposed to be. She looked up then, eyes softer than I'd ever seen, and exhaled as if she'd been holding the air inside her for hours. "I haven't told anyone," she said, voice low, almost brittle. "Not for a long time." I waited. Said nothing. I didn't need to. She needed to speak. "It was years ago," she continued, fingers twisting the handle of her mug. "Someone I thought I could trust, someone I loved more than I knew how to carry. And I lost him. Not just lost him, but everything that came with him." Her voice cracked, just a little, like a record skipping over the hardest part. I could feel the weight of it pressing down in the small space between us, the faint tremble in her hands, the way her shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't need to be. The quiet honesty, the bare vulnerability, was enough to shake me inside. I wanted to reach across the table, to steady her somehow, but I stayed where I was, letting her have the space to exist in her own grief. Then, almost reflexively, I remembered something. A conversation we'd had months ago, a photograph she had absent-mindedly touched while laughing about someone she missed. "You remind me of him," I said carefully, not meeting her eyes at first. My throat felt tight, not in who he was, but in the way you carry yourself, the way you laugh, the way you pause before saying something important. It's like a memory I never thought I'd see again. Her head lifted slowly, a flicker of something, recognition, fear, maybe a little hope, passing over her features. Her lips parted, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at me, unblinking, as if trying to measure whether I was speaking the truth or some cruel echo of the past. The cafe felt smaller, warmer, and somehow more fragile than it had an hour ago. The hum of the espresso machine, the quiet clink of cups, all of it seemed distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was the subtle tremor in her hands and the way her eyes flicked toward mine, holding a question she couldn't, or wouldn't, say aloud. Finally, she exhaled, leaning back, letting her fingers trail over the table like she was testing gravity. "Maybe," she whispered, barely audible, "maybe some things aren't gone the way we think." Her words hit me differently than anything before, gentle, almost tender, but loaded with an unspoken seismic shift. For a fraction of a second, I thought the world had paused just to let us exist in that fragile, trembling moment. And then the moment ended. The coffee cooled, the rain outside continuing, but nothing between us would ever feel ordinary again. We were in the bookstore again, the late afternoon sun casting long stripes across the wooden floor. The hum of the old air conditioner was low, almost companionable. She was perched on the edge of the counter, knees tucked under her, scrolling through a stack of invoices she didn't really need to look at. I leaned against the opposite shelf, trying to act casual, but my hands felt heavy in my pockets. For a long time, neither of us spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate, like two people measuring the distance between themselves and the inevitable. I watched her braid her fingers absent-mindedly, the faint tremor of her hands betraying the calm mask she usually wore. "I don't know what we're doing," she said finally, quiet, like she was testing the air, seeing if I would flinch. I didn't flinch. "Neither do I," I admitted, voice low. "But I'm okay with that." She glanced up at me, eyebrows slightly raised, a hint of disbelief in her expression. Her lips curved in the smallest, cautious smile. There was a tension in her shoulders that slowly released, as if hearing those words had let her breathe for the first time in days. We didn't talk much after that, just sat, existed in the same space, letting the quiet stretch. I noticed everything. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the faint warmth radiating from her hands, the tiny smudge of ink on her thumb from cataloging receipts. She noticed me noticing, I think, and didn't look away. At some point, I slid closer, careful, deliberate, giving her the choice to retreat without a word. She didn't. Her hand moved slightly, brushing against mine as she reached for her coffee mug. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a current through me that neither of us acknowledged. Instead, we let it sit there, quiet and unspoken, the weight of it more telling than any declaration. The world outside, books, invoices, the fading sunlight, slipped away. There was no need for words, no urgency to name what we both felt. It was enough to share the space, the rhythm of each other's breathing, the simple truth that we were choosing to be present with one another. Finally, she leaned back, resting her forehead briefly against the counter, and I felt the shift, subtle, inevitable, earned. I moved a fraction closer, resting my own hand near hers, letting the warmth meet, not demanding, just existing. She didn't pull away. She didn't need to. In that small, quiet gesture, the touch of a hand, the shared silence, Everything we'd skirted around, every hesitation, every fear, every almost, collapsed into understanding. And then, as the sun dipped lower, painting the walls in muted gold, we stayed like that. Not speaking, not labeling, not rushing. Just two people who had finally arrived at a place they didn't need words to explain. And in that soft, deliberate quiet, I realized we had, in our own fragile, human way, found what mattered most. I can still remember that quiet moment in the bookstore, even now, months later. Not the books, not the invoices, not the fading sunlight. Just the way she and I existed in the same space, and how something unspoken passed between us that didn't need naming. I've thought about it often, about the slow way it happened, how tension became understanding, how restraint turned into connection without fanfare or fireworks. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't simple, but it was real. That's what matters. She's different now, too. I can see it in the way she carries herself, in the small ways she lets herself rest, in the almost imperceptible softening when she laughs. She's still confident, still layered, still brilliant. But there's a quiet ease now, a willingness to let someone in without losing herself. Watching her, I realized that love, the kind that sneaks in between pauses and silences, isn't about grand declarations or perfect timing. It's about noticing, staying, understanding, and letting someone see the pieces they didn't even know were there. As for me, I've learned patience. I've learned how to read the spaces between words, how to linger in silence without fear, and how to let connection grow naturally instead of forcing it. I've learned that sometimes the most profound things happen in the moments that feel almost mundane. The brushing of a hand, the pause before a word, the way someone lets you exist in their world for just a moment longer. Our story didn't happen in a single moment, didn't climax in a dramatic confession or a perfect kiss. It happened in the collection of small, intentional choices, showing up, holding space, listening, pausing, waiting, understanding. And in that, we found something that was entirely ours, something fragile, earned, and entirely human. I think that's what love is, sometimes, not the kind you see in movies or hear in songs, but the kind that exists quietly, persistently, in the shared space between two people who notice, who care, who stay. And for that, I'll always be grateful, even for the confusion, the hesitations, and the almost that brought us to this. So here we are. Not perfect, not resolved in every way, but enough. Enough to know that this story, this connection, will linger in both of us in the quietest, most powerful ways. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?